Hi guys, welcome to another Momentum webinar. Today our webinar topic is on dev quality principles. I'm Anna Sullivan, one of the marketing leads at Momentum Group, and presenting today is Will Ericksson, our managing director. Over to you, Will.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Good to see you, and thanks for joining us. So today we're going to be talking about some dev quality principles, and please, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat at any time. I'm more than happy to have a look at those during and after. So what I'm going to do, let's give some context for this. This webinar is aimed at founders or organizations who are using Bubble or who are considering using Bubble. It's also for product managers and developers who are in the same category, so using Bubble. And more specifically, the question that we're answering today is, okay, so I want to build a product on Bubble, or I have built a product on Bubble already, or I'm in the process of doing so. And I really want to know, is our dev doing a good job, or will they do a good job? Will our product actually perform at any kind of scale that we would like to achieve in our process? And how do I know that the work done is actually of a high quality? So just start with a quick case study. This is one of our clients, Social Suite, and we were engaged by Social Suite last year to perform an initial 2-week scope just to look at their app, their existing app, and to do a performance improvement piece on that app in that period. So they had an existing product in market already, built on Salesforce, and then they developed a new product. They developed an MVP on Bubble. So they had a second market opportunity to look at, and they thought, okay, let's try Bubble out. They found a developer, they built out an MVP, and what they did really well was they got something out the door. So they found they had a product they could take and try out with some customers. They actually got 40 customers on board with their product. And a customer in that context is actually an organization who will come and start to measure their performance against environmental, social governance principles. So it's not a small feat to get a client. So getting 40 people onto the MVP is fantastic. And I think the MVP really performed in that piece around finding product market fit. And then, but what happened was they needed to then find a partner who had some more resources, as in more people who could work on the project at the same time, and also some expertise to solve some of the challenges they were having. So we came and had a look at the project with them, and we did a 2-week scope just to have a look at the app and to have a look at what was causing some of the issues and to put in place a few fixes to try and address those things. So here's what we did. The first thing we do in a situation like this, and we have done a number of projects like this, is to really capture the current state of the app. And so we'll do a standard set of diagrams just to really understand how the app is working and to have some time to really reflect on what's working well and what could be improved in order to achieve the aims of the client. So these are the kind of things we usually do. I'll show you an example, but a solution architecture diagram, entity relationships, usually chart the privacy rules in a table, look at some backend workflows in some flow charts, draw up a sitemap of the pages as they've implemented them, and also look at the actual page structure in each, like what are the elements on the page. I'll just give you an example of this. So this is a very basic example. It's something I've been using when I'm teaching, but usually we'll draw out a nice diagram like this where we just have, Bubble typically is in the middle as the web application, and then around that we'll sit and we'll have the different services that it would use. So every Bubble app usually uses Google Maps for geolocation and SendGrid for email, but then, you might have Stripe for payments or Google Analytics. You might send out messages to Slack when there's an event that happens. You might have You might integrate with Xero for accounting. So there might be an active campaign integration for email marketing. So all these things that sit around Bubble and can be used. And just drawing that out on a map often just gives a nice visual of the system and how the pieces are relating and exchanging data. And even just drawing that can be quite a helpful view. The second thing we do is usually map out the data. So we use a few different tools, but the main one will be an entity relationship diagram, where we just map out the tables and their relationships. And we try and capture an understanding of what those relationships are. So here you can see there's a few different tables or entities in this database. You've got user, you've got recipe, and then we've got the fields under those tables. So I think about, name, profile photo, and then there's also some relationships there. So you can see that like one user can have many recipes in this particular app. So this is a simple example, but when you do this, you find sometimes it's quite easy to see where some of the improvements can be made. And it's also a really nice visual way of just seeing how things are laid out and then being able to workshop improvements. This is a really good and interesting example. So database privacy rules. In Bubble, it is really important to make sure that you do put privacy rules in place, because even if you don't expose data on pages, you can still theoretically access that data through the API that pulls data out if your tables are exposed. So typically we will just have a table. We'll have a column of data types. We'll have the different user roles. So in this case, there's just one, it's user, but we might have multiple in other scenarios. And then the right-hand side is public. So, and really we're just describing what the functionality should be achieving. So then that gives some context for when you go into the privacy rules tab, what is implemented. The scary thing I keep finding is that a lot of projects, people don't implement any privacy rules. And this is a common theme. I talk to a lot of people that have even gone with some of the more larger, more well-known agencies that have say that they specialize in Bubble, and they just haven't implemented privacy rules at all, or they've implemented ones like when current user is logged in, show all users. So they basically, if you log in, you can see any user's data in the whole app. And that is quite scary and insecure. So mapping them out just gives a really good ability to see, okay, so what are the issues and what do we need to improve? Same thing with backend workflows and API endpoints. It's just helpful to map them out in a visual way and have them in a list where we can, describe the purpose and also start to look at some of the commonalities across them. So this table here, this is an example more triggers, but like a data type, trigger, so any conditions applied, and then some notes or in a description. Mapping out, especially when you get quite complicated in the workflows, in the backend workflows, it's good to have a reference point and documentation so you can plan these out a bit more thoroughly. And then the other thing is generic page structure. So like, what does a page look like and how are you using elements on the page in a consistent way across pages? So like, this is a very simple example, but we might have a header, which is a reusable element, and then we might have a group, which is called container, logged in, and then we just have some logic on that container logged in, which says it's visible on page load is set to false, but then when the user logs in, then we set that to true. Or when the user is logged in and the user role equals the role that should have access to that data or that view of data, then this element is visible equals true. This is also a really good place to talk about things like page redirects. So what happens when you go to a page and maybe there's no URL parameter, then you can have those redirects documented here. You can have your URL parameters, any states that might hold information. And so having a bit of a design outside of Bubble where you can visually see, okay, what are the 3 or 4 important things on the page, can be a really helpful just way of helping to understand, and also see if it's been implemented in a way that's optimal. Same thing with sitemap. It can be really helpful just to map out the sitemap, make sure that all the pages connect to other pages. Also identify pages that are not in use, or pages that have maybe been developed as a test but then just sort of left and not tidied up. So what the name of the page is, how it sits within the hierarchy, if there's a type of content on a page, which is also useful information. And yeah, that can, I guess, any markup around that. So notes about what those pages are, or even potential things we noticed that were issues. And then just a broad category. I mean, we use flowcharts for different reasons. Like our UX team will use it around like task and user flows. But we also use it from a dev perspective to say, okay, how does this workflow run? And if it's a complicated one, have we perhaps properly visualize the logic in Bubble, or do we, if we map it out like this, we might be able to see ways we can optimize it better, and then come back to Bubble and make those changes. So that's just a really simple example of the type of documentation we would do, either when we're starting a new project, or when we're coming in to look at why something's not performing well, or if it's been done properly. Now, obviously, I think just have to acknowledge that a lot of scenarios, people have been asked to do things quickly. They've been asked to do things iteratively. And so they've built up perhaps an approach that made sense when you were doing a 2-week project, but it didn't make sense when you're doing a 12-week project. So fully acknowledge that not every app will be pretty, and things do grow, but there's a point at which things should be also refactored, and you think, okay, well, if we're going to be running this app for 5 years, or for 3 years, or for 2 years, then we need to implement our code. Even though Bubble is no code, it's still code, it's just visual code. We need to implement that code in a way that we can look after. So it's not so much a judgment on people when they haven't done a really robust job, but it's more saying, look, you might have been asked to do a 4-week or a 6-week MVP, and great, we've passed that test, and now it's time to look at how do we enhance that. So for the case study here, we measured our current state performance, and we found that some of the key pages were loading slowly. And by slow, we're sort of saying over 10 seconds, which was quite concerning. And we found that even the Bubble editor itself was quite sluggish, which is a big red flag. So the reason for that was that we found pages were bloated with a lot of elements that had been copied and pasted. So rather than use a list, the previous developer had just copied and pasted a whole bunch of the same thing, and then just changed the dynamic expressions in each one to reference the next one in a list. So it was almost like the page had to do the same work about 10 times or 20 times harder than it should have had to. The recursive backend workflows were executing while the user waited. So what this means is there was a big workflow that generated a whole bunch of data, probably generated about 100 rows of data. And this workflow would happen when the user pressed a button, but it would take about 30 seconds to run, which didn't leave the user feeling like the app had that level of speed that they were expecting. We also noticed that a few of the tables did not have any privacy rules applied, and we had found that there was actually a big use of option sets. Option sets are great, but perhaps a little bit too heavy in this case. Some of the downsides of option sets are that you can't change them from the users of the app can't change them, only the developer can change them. And when you have a lot of attributes on your option sets, and you've got like 3 or 4 option sets which are all referencing each other in this nice relational structure, it can actually be really hard to manage, and even to see what's going on as a developer. So we felt that the use of option sets was actually it was pushing the definition of what an option set should be. So what we did then was we created a future state version of the same documentation, and then we proposed that to the client, and we did a rework of the existing app. So we deleted out some old pages and tidied them up. We reworked the key dashboard page that I was talking about that was making even the editor crash, and we reduced the elements on the page from about 3,000 to about 300. We tested the bubble app export JSON file pre and post, and it went from 18 megabytes to 9 megabytes with that one change alone. So I think a lot of the problems were coming from that page. And yeah, the page and data was substantially improved in terms of time. We also had a look at the backend workflow, and we redesigned that so that it would happen before the user was even in the app. And then when they came into the app and wanted to show it, it would just flick a switch, so they would see it. So it was more of the timing of the workflow and the way that it worked. So that gave a massive increase in perceived speed. We added the privacy rules that we felt were missing in order to secure the data. And we actually had to do a migration. So we moved those option sets into a table, into an actual database table to give us the full flexibility of the database view. And that would be a more maintainable option in the long term for this particular app. So the client feedback after the process was, I finally feel like I understand how the app works now. And that was from their product owner, Nish. And then the next steps after that, we've been an ongoing partner with Social Suite to do a continuous sort of agile product and project on their app. So we have 2.5 people working with them now each week, one full-time designer and 1.5 full-time devs, and we're continuing to iterate and roll out features, including a UI redesign and a whole bunch of backend automation workflows around increasing the client engagement with like automated emails and prompts when they need to come back and do things with their company's reporting. So it was a good project. I guess coming out of this, to go back to dev standards and to talk about some of the things that we've done in a whole bunch of projects and what we're trying to do. We've stated our mission on our webpage as to build high quality, scalable tech products with no code tools. And that breaks down, I guess, into these 5 points. So scalable, reliable, maintainable, secure, testable. These are the things that require thought. So if we dive into a project and don't think about them, then, they always end up popping up later and causing more pain. So, everything's relative to what the immediate need of the client is. So if it's just, hey, I need to get out a quick MVP in 3 weeks and then test an idea on the market, it's fine. Like, we can definitely tolerate something that's not as technically well thought out and perfect. But over time, if the plan is then to build on that, then it's about putting things in place so that we can make sure that we're not giving ourselves a major headache down the track. So what we found is that when we start to implement some quality standards, it means that multiple developers in a team can actually work together on a project in a productive way. And then future developers will actually be able to provide support and modifications, and this all within a time and a cost-effective way. The flip side of this is when it's really disorganized and messy, you end up with a bit of technical debt, and then everyone's treading on each other's toes, and there's not sort of a time or a cost-effective path forward. And so having standards and following them is not really an option. It's more of a necessity if you want to be doing anything that really gets into the real world. So I guess another thought that I just wanted to throw out there is that really as a developer or as a client, both sides really are looking for trusted partners, and that's what it comes down to. If both sides come to the table in good faith and look after each other and try to be a good partner, then this is when the relationships work really, really well. So this is what we've come down to after a lot of different conversations and working with different clients. And yeah, even I'll just acknowledge, so yeah, Nish from Social Suite, Alon from Canella, Chris from Chasm Digital. We've worked with some really great, really experienced clients in the product space who have had, you know, many decades of product building experience each. And I guess, you know, conversation with them, reflections on our own projects. We've come up with this list at the moment, and it's an evolving list, but this is where we're at. I think the first thing is really to simplify the design. So, you know, when it's a small project, of course we need to be lightweight and simple. But even when it's a big project, we need to come up with a design that will, a technical design that will be maintainable and will be testable, will be understandable. If we overly inflate it with different things, then it can get quite confusing quite quickly. And so I think with this, an example might be, you could have 2 or 3 database tables, but you may only need one. And by pulling it back to one, you're actually making a lot of your expressions easier to write. And you might be making the querying of data more sort of accessible. And so there's just less room for error. Another thing could be the way that you reference elements on a page. Like you could sort of have like refer to the parent, or you could just have like one thing on a page that holds the data and then everything references to that. So it's really consistent. So simplicity means less room for mistakes, easier to understand. People can come in and understand the project quickly and support it rather than being really confusing. Second thing about documentation. Documentation is tricky because too much, it will get out of date, but too little, and then you're sort of leaving the next person to reverse engineer everything you did. So I think the rule of thumb will be document everything that needs explanation. And we definitely advocate for a discrete design phase and thinking about things on paper or on virtual whiteboarding rather than just implementing, because, you know, I think all these programming courses talk about planning and diagrams and pseudocode, and it's not the sexy thing. But when you don't do it and you have a substantial project, then you end up with poor design decisions that then come back to bite you later. So document, design, keep a clear record of what things are meant to do and the thinking behind them. The third thing there is don't repeat yourself. Centralizing your business logic in your app, and there's a number of ways to do this, but I think having examples like using database triggers for calculations will be one thing. You know, where possible, put things in reusable elements. Even using reusable elements to hold workflows and dynamic expressions as a like, rather than sort of having a lot of the same things copied across the app, like in repetitive ways, having custom workflows as well, using API workflows. So there are a few examples, but always be thinking, how can I avoid repeating myself? Because if you're copying and pasting the same expression 10 times and it's a complicated one, like it might be do a search for X with condition A equals A, condition B is greater than something, condition C is, you know, equal to that, condition D is true, first item filtered by, and then a bunch of other stuff, and you're copying that like 10 times into different places, it's pretty soon that someone's going to come and accidentally delete one of those things, and you're going to get a bug that's really hard to track down. So even doing things like having putting your conditional on the workflow, maybe having 2 different workflows, one for each path of logic, rather than having like a workflow that's 30 things long with like multiple strands of logic running in it. Things of that sort can be useful as well. Race conditions. So this one's quite an interesting concept, and the idea being that you can perform well in the training field, but when you get onto race day, that's when your app actually needs to perform. And I think the underlying thing here is just assume that things won't always go according to plan, and then engineer for that. So really think about, what is this thing going to be like in the real world, and how will it interact? And so sometimes things that make sense in isolation suddenly don't make sense in a wider app. It might be, well, we got caught by one that I was doing a recursive workflow for, say, 10 minutes at a point each week, and the expressions inside that workflow were calling data, but then users could be updating that data. So potentially the list that was being iterated over could actually change whilst the workflow is executing. So I mean, look, it's an edge case, but you've got to think about these things when you're deploying something in the real world. And then identify risks and solve these issues first. So like a good example will be, if you've got a project that's 12 weeks long and you've got a difficult API integration, don't leave that till week 10. Go and do a proof of concept, figure out if it can work, and test out the things that you're not confident about, and then solve that. And if you can't solve it, then let the client know in week 1 or 2, and then come up with a different solution, rather than leaving it to the end of the project until everything just you're so close to the finish line, and the expectation is that it's going to be done, and then you don't deliver it. So and that can be not just an API, but any number of different project risks. So in terms of our process, these are the things that we are starting to implement now, and we have done them in some ways, but I think getting a real consistency around this is how we can work on a multi-developer team. So having a group code review and looking at scenarios and coming up with general approaches to scenarios that we then make sure we follow is really important. Secondly, getting lead developers to review the code before we push it into live.
I think Will's just frozen. Let me ping him on Slack to see if he, how his internet's going. It looks like it's just frozen a bit.
Hi everyone, sorry about that. I will just finish off. Is that good, Anna?
Yeah.
Yeah. I lost all the Q&A as well. That's annoying. Alrighty, so yeah, I was just finishing up that. We do our different processes. What we've found through talking to a lot of people is that there is actually a lack of professionalism in the freelancer and agency bubble ecosystem, which is a bit sad. And I think it just reflects that Bubble's opened up a lot of opportunities for people, but maybe some of the people don't fully grasp the skill or the product. So there's a lot of underquoting, people missing their what they think they can do in the time that they suggest they can do it. And that's not only a money thing, but that's a time thing as well. So it might seem like a good idea to go with a developer that says I'm $10 an hour, I'm $30 an hour or something, but the real question is, will they be able to do what they think they can do in the timeline that they think they can do it? So we keep talking to people that say it's taken me a year to build a two-sided marketplace, or it's taken me 6 months to build something that should really haven't taken that long. So I think the time variable is what Bubble should be saving you, and if it's not saving you time, then you probably need to think about who you're working with. Then I think the other things are clients and project teams not being well aligned. So again, that's a function of project management. And what we've again found is that, a Bubble dev project may not have a developer, a designer, a project manager, a backend developer, a QA tester. Like, it's more likely to have 1 or 2 people working on it. And so, and those people are often on the tools, they're not doing the project management. So having having someone or having an agreed approach to project management will save a lot of pain and problems. And then the last thing I think is that technical work often must be reworked, or that isn't ideal or optimal. And that again isn't necessarily always a whole app. It could just be that there's haven't implemented privacy rules, or they haven't thought about how a workflow is going to run when you deploy it. So in terms of takeaways for you, if you are in the situation of looking to engage a developer and wanting to know if it's going to be good quality, then I would be asking questions like, how do you actually plan out your app? Like, what do you do? What sort of documentation do you do? What will you give me? How collaborative is that process? Then I'd be asking about, how do you manage the project? So what's your process there? Which tools do you use? How do you communicate? What's your regular meeting schedule? How do you deploy into testing so that we can be incrementally testing the product? A big one is, will you implement privacy rules? And I think this one will probably, it'll divide up who's got a solid grasp on the tool and who's still quite basic, but ask them how they implement the privacy rules and what sort of even just having a really clear grasp on each user role in the app and what each user role will not be able to see from a data perspective. If they're not securing the database at that level, then they're not doing enough to secure the data. So that will be an interesting question to ask your potential developers. Another one is, who will do code review? So who will actually look across the work that's done and decide, has this been done in a way that's best practice, or at least a good fit for the particular priority in the situation? So yes, quick MVP, it's fine just to knock it up and get it done. But again, if that then becomes a 12-week project or a 20-week project, who's actually looking at that work to know that it's not just a big mess? And what's their experience? The last one is, how do you manage project risks? So how do you actually identify risks and then put plans in place to make sure that you adequately address those risks? And that could be, like I said, the tricky API integration, or the calendar plugin that they have a specific need for. Like, can we do that? And it might be other things like of a less technical nature, but having a clear idea about that is really important. So we can help with this as well. We provide product management, UX, UI design, and bubble dev. We also provide advisory functions. We do both app reviews, and we also build we can build an app from scratch, or we can do a existing review of an app and then sort of enhance that and scale that up in phases. And again, the last thing there is just an emphasis on the quality and the long-term partnership. So working to the priority of the client and understanding what they're actually trying to do, understanding what's a commercial decision for the client. So it's not commercial often to spend $100,000 on an MVP to test an idea. Like, we need a solution for that situation, which is, hey, let's get something out quick, and it might be a bit ugly, but we're going to just test an idea and see if 20 people buy it. And if 20 people buy it, then that initial $10,000 or $15,000 perhaps could then become another phase of work. So look at what's a commercial decision for the client that actually will lead them to succeed, rather than just saying, hey, yeah, we'll just do an MVP because that's our business. If you'd like any help, please reach out. This is our email, hello@MomentumGroup.Tech. We will jump on a call with you and just have a chat and see if Bubble is a good tool for your app, or if the app you've got now you'd like to improve, then we can have a look at that and say, it might be 3 days of just working through creating some documentation, making some recommendations. It might be implementing those recommendations, but more than happy to do that. Just again, wanted to highlight some of our clients. We've delivered over 20 projects. Some of those have been like 1,000 hours of dev time and the substantial projects. Some of our clients have raised significant amounts of capital, or they've built businesses with substantial revenue. So we're working with a whole range of different people, from early stage founders through to large organizations that are leveraging Bubble to try out new ideas and to iterate on those ideas quickly. It's a really, really exciting space to be in right now. So yeah, thanks for listening. Yeah, I was just going to reflect. I think John asked a question about the privacy rules, and in terms of testing privacy rules, I don't think there's any easy way to test privacy rules other than to look at your different user roles and then go through and test the app thoroughly from a QA perspective against each user role. So we would just have to have a QA testing, a bunch of test cases, and then get the QA tester to go through and actually do each of those. I would also just rely on the debugger, so you can see in the debugger which fields are blocked for each user. So when you run as a particular user type and you're testing it, then you can see, okay, these 5 fields are blocked for that user. It is tricky when you've got multiple layers of different privacy rules, but I think that's the best you can do. It's quite a manual process. If there's any other questions, please feel free to ask.
He's got one at the bottom of the Q&A, and it's, what tools do we use for documentation, and do we have standards to rewrite it?
Yeah, so we use Lucidchart for our documentation. We've tried a few different options, but it's probably my favorite from an ease of use perspective. And we will have a standard template which we usually work off, but then we'll adapt that to the need of the project. So yeah, usually, like I said, it goes through those things earlier in the presentation, and yeah, just keep it flexible as well. Okay, all of the questions and stuff disappeared when my internet dropped out, so sorry about that, but I hope you found that helpful. And yeah, we're more than happy to have a chat about your project, or even just any questions that might come up afterwards. So thanks for listening, and yeah, catch you guys on the next one.
Thanks, guys.